Hello. We are at my studio in London. I am Fion Gunn, and this is Audrey Mullins, and we are the artists who have prepared today's presentation, and we'll be showing our films to you. So we'll start with the first one.
Let us see. Let us say how she is the one. It is she who conceives, and she who does bear. She who knitted us in the womb, and who will cradle our tomb, fraying. Daily she offers her arms, clothes us in compassion, smiles as we wriggle for baubles. Yet it is she who lifts you aloft, to whisper through your ears, to kiss through your eyes, to touch her cooling cheek to your cheek. If we could only summon or see them, these women, foremothers of the nurture and dignity that will come to all of us from this day, we could say across the century to each one, "Give me your hand. It has written our future. Our future will become the past of other women."
My painting is an emotive and exploratory response to the land where I grew up. My experimentation with paint and colour across horizontal planes are memories of where I once lived. My process begins by putting improvised marks on a surface, removing, elaborating on them, and transforming them over a period of several months. The Irish countryside, the pull of the land, and the struggle to leave it has been a constant theme in my work. The value of land and landscape has always been evident in Irish culture. In the 60s, much of Ireland, north and south, was a predominantly rural society. Many of its most influential writers and artists were from the countryside, and inevitably rural imagery coloured their writing and art. And here I move on to St. Brigid. St. Brigid's Day is the first national holiday named in honour of a woman. She was an activist, a feminist, an environmentalist who fearlessly championed the rights of the poor and animals. There are legends of how Brigid, as a young woman, would take butter and food from her own home and give it to the poor. There is another legend where St. Brigid asked the King of Leinster for land in Kildare to build a monastery. It was the perfect place near a lake where water was available, near trees where there was firewood, and near fertile land where she could grow her crops. But the king refused her request. Brigid was determined to build the monastery, and she prayed that the king would change his mind. She made her request again, but this time she asked, "Give me as much land as my cloak will cover." When the King of Leinster saw her small cloak, he laughed and gave her the land, but Brigid had instructed her 4 helpers, each to take a corner of the cloak and walk in opposite directions, north, south, east and west. When they did this, the cloak began to grow and spread across many acres of land. She now had the land on which to build her monastery. The King of Leinster realised that this woman was truly blessed by God, and he became a patron of Brigid's monastery, helping her with money and food. Later he converted to Christianity. There is an old Irish saying, "There's room for everyone under Brigid's cloak." And in these divisive times, St. Brigid calls on us to remember our true humanity. Like Brigid, I am navigating the liminal zone between the real world and the make-believe, speaking only in colour and brushstrokes.
So, Audrey, in the film you made about your work, you described the story of St. Brigid. What about that story grabbed you? And as a child, what was the thing that you found magical about it?
So growing up in Ireland, we had to learn Irish in school, and we could do subjects through Irish if we wanted to. It was really important. You couldn't pass an exam unless you could speak the Irish language. And there was a book that we had to read. It was part of the curriculum by a woman called Peg Sayers, who lived in a remote part of Ireland. She grew up in Dingle, and the book was Ná Scéal Féin. It was written in Irish, and I found learning the Irish language very difficult, and I found it very difficult to connect with that book. But interestingly, in later life, when I left Ireland and then went back to Ireland, I really wanted to go and visit the Blasket Islands where she grew up. And we got a small boat out there. It was very rough, and the sea was rough. It was hectic crossing, quite terrifying actually. And once we got onto the island, I wasn't sure if we would actually get off. And then I was there with my husband and my mother and my daughter. We got onto the island and we went exploring. We were the only 4 people on the island. The man in the boat was just waiting for us. We had 2 hours on the island by ourselves. And it was incredible. It was almost a spiritual experience. We ran down onto the beach, just seeing our footprints, only our footprints across the beach. There was actually a donkey on the island. And lots of seals on the beach, and just the sound of the seals, and just the expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. It was beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And then I took some photographs. We made our way back to the boat, and he wasn't sure if he could actually make the journey back because long ago, when Peg Sayers lived there, they would be marooned on the island for months at a time, and they couldn't get onto the mainland because the weather would be bad, and they were reduced to eating seals. So in that book, there's lots of stories about killing seals and small birds. The island was actually too barren to grow crops on, so they had a very poor existence. And I suppose as a child, the book, it sort of depressed me, but actually going back and seeing it, I saw it in another light. So when you made your film, what inspired you to make it that way?
Okay, so I chose not to make a film so much about my work as to make a film that is part of my work. I've begun to work using virtual reality. So what I did was I created a landscape environment in virtual reality, and I then filmed that. And I find that a very fascinating process, because it's like having the most amazing studio in the world. It's huge and you can do anything you like in it. I did run into some problems because it's a complex environment with, each of the trees is made individually. So, so I have to be careful not to get carried away and make it very, very detailed. But I wanted to combine it with actual footage of the landscape that inspired it. So it's very much based on that idea of the field, and it's floating, and it's surrounding people, and it's an environment that you become immersed in, just as the magic cloak became an immersive environment for the nuns. So so that's what I did, and I put everything together. It's quite multi-layered, so each part of the film might have 3, 4, 5 layers of filming happening at the same time. But I wanted to conjure something of the magical nature of the landscape, that, as a child, you close your eyes and you imagine yourself somewhere, and then waking up, it's a different experience. But I wanted to conjure that sort of dreamlike aspect of things.
I enjoyed the story very much. I particularly enjoyed St. Brigid's cunning plan to get help of 4 nuns with a cloak and get the land for the monastery. And it brought me back to thinking about the importance of landscape and land ownership in Ireland, growing up in quite a remote small town and surrounded by mountains where we would go for walks as children. My father always wanted to take us to very remote places with no people. And as a child, I did want to be with other children and play with them, but we would always seek out the most remote place to go for walks. And that memory of landscape has stayed with me. That memory of remote landscape in Ireland has always been with me.
We've often discussed how we're influenced by Irish literature in our work, and certainly I know that technically I would say that my practice is almost Joycean in how I combine 100 different narratives that happen simultaneously and make sort of very complex work in that way. So I identify quite closely with Joyce's process. However, there are other writers who have meant a great deal to me over the years. Yeats, of course, but more recently than that, Evan Boland, who wrote an incredibly moving poem, Child of Our Times, after the bombing in Dublin, which killed many children and ordinary people. And I've always felt very deeply about her work. And she's also written about landscape in a way that both of us have been affected by. And so, Audrey, if you wouldn't mind reading some of the work that from her work that has really been very appropriate to quote now.
Evan Boland, The Lost Land. And memory itself has become an emigrant, wandering in a place where love dissembles itself as landscape, where the hills are the colours of a child's eyes, where my children are distances, horizons. At night, on the edge of sleep, I can see the shore of Dublin Bay, its rocky sweep and its granite pier.
One of the commonalities in our sort of approach to our work and to our lives is the fact we are both diaspora Irish artists, and we're both living in London. And we come from a country that was at the sharp end of empire, and now we are living at the heart of empire, although the empire is past. So these are things that have affected, I think, our work and our practices. And I wonder what you thought about that feeling of diaspora and how has that affected you in particular?
The Irish countryside, the pull of the land and the struggle to leave it has always been a constant theme in my work.
Yeah, and it's also, in a sense, we're very typical of historic diasporas because it was the women who left because the women didn't own the land. The men stayed on the land and were often bachelors living very lonely lives on farms in the west of Ireland with, a sort of impoverished social life. Whereas the women went off abroad, got educations and had lives elsewhere. But the connections are still there. And I don't know if you find it as well, but I think there's a certain, for me, sadness that hangs in the land.
Oh, yes.
That maybe where that comes from, I don't know, maybe from the famine, maybe from many years of living in great poverty, but there is a certain sort of wistful melancholy that one finds in Ireland, perhaps more than in other places. And finally, going back to that whole issue of the land in Ireland and who owns the land. Incidentally, at the moment, it's 13% of the land is owned by women. But there is a famous play called The Field by John B. Keane. And do you remember watching that when you were young?
I do remember it, about the struggle to keep the land and the fighting that went on between families, the importance of land ownership in Ireland.
And it's very ruthless as well, and sort of there's something tribal about it and very unpragmatic. It's violent and conflict fueled, and that sort of shadow is also there too. So we would recommend reading The Field or watching a performance of it. It's very interesting and it gives you the dark side of Irish landscape. Our work isn't really that dark, I think. So thank you for watching.
Thank you.
And do keep in touch. Bye-bye.